The year was 1976. It was the United States bicentennial. But something happened in that year that was quite unique in the wine world. There was a competition happening in France that year. So all of these incredible wine critics and famous winemakers all gathered together to taste wine blind. So they had absolutely no idea what was in their glasses. And at the end of the tasting, there were two wines that really showed out above the rest. What were they? It was the Chateau Montelena Chardonnay and the Stag's Leap Cabernet Sauvignon. Here we are at Stag's Leap, and this is Lecture 17, California. This is the first time we're speaking about the United States. The competition I spoke of, the 1976 Judgment of Paris, really thrust American wines, California in particular, onto the international scene. It put America on the map for high-quality wines, as the first country in the New World to go up against the benchmark of France and create a unique style that the world has come to respect and recognize. For today's lecture, you're going to need the following wines: a Cabernet Sauvignon from Napa Valley, a Left Bank Bordeaux, a Chardonnay, a Sauvignon Blanc, a Merlot, a Pinot Noir, we have one from Russian River, or you may find one from Carneros or Santa Barbara, a Zinfandel, as well as a Petit Syrah if you have it. Now, before we get into this lecture, I want to demonstrate Old World versus New World to you. We've talked about this in other lectures, but I thought I'd really point it out to you on your own palate. If you'd like to do this with me, then get out your Cabernet Sauvignon for today. And if you have one or want to stop the DVD and go get one and come back, grab a Left Bank Bordeaux. Just make sure that the price of both wines are relatively the same and that they're from the same vintage. This makes it much more apples to apples. So let's compare and contrast the color of both of these wines. Well, they're roughly similar. Both are made from Cabernet Sauvignon, so they're thick-skinned grape varieties, so it's no surprise that they're both deep ruby purple. Here we have our Frog's Leap is a little bit deeper in color than the Pauillac that we have. Now let's smell both of these wines. They're very different in their aromas. Now, you'll notice that the Frog's Leap Cabernet Sauvignon is much more upfront in its fruit than the Pauillac. This is a bit more reserved in its fruit. You may get, in the Pauillac, you may even get more pencil shavings and cedar and tobacco. And when you smell the Cabernet Sauvignon from California, you get a lot more upfront black currants and that cassis fruit coming out. Now go back to smell the Bordeaux. Do you smell that minerality? If you didn't get it before, you may now by comparing and contrasting these two wines together. This is Old World versus New World. And when you hear critics and sommeliers or others talk about it, this is exactly what they're talking about. Now, let's look at the palate. You'll notice that on the palate, the California Cabernet Sauvignon is much riper in its fruit and has a little bit lower amount of acidity. That's a clue to us that this comes from a warmer climate. But what I want you to see too is the focus of these two wines is quite different. The California wine is, like I said, more upfront in its fruit character, and the Bordeaux is more reserved in its fruit. But it's more focused on its terroir-driven notes, more the minerality, the pencil shavings, and even a hint of violets. But this is not to say one is better than the other. They're both around the same price. But I want you to see the differences between these two wines and really appreciate them both for what they are. Now, in Lecture 1, I mentioned that the U.S. looks to be the #1 consuming nation of wine in the world. So where did our love affair with wine begin in the United States? We loved wine from the beginning. Some of our founding fathers, such as Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson, were wine fans. Benjamin Franklin is known to have said, "Wine is a constant proof that God loves us and loves to see us happy." And you may remember a book that came out in 2008 called The Billionaire's Vinegar, which is about the most expensive bottle of wine in the world, allegedly owned by Thomas Jefferson, that broke records for price sold at auction in 1985. Thomas Jefferson traveled all throughout Europe and repeatedly wrote home to encourage friends to purchase specific wines he really liked. He might be America's first wine critic, actually. He even knew of the health benefits of wine, and he's known for saying, "I double the doctor's glass and a half of wine, and I even treble it with a friend." Now that's a wine enthusiast. When I first studied wine, I thought to myself that our founding fathers certainly loved imported wine, but I didn't really think of the original colonies as wine producers. However, just as in Europe with monasteries, wine production in California began in earnest with the missionaries. And after the California gold rush in 1849, we see population, vineyards, and commercialism increase, particularly around the regions of what we know today as Sonoma, Napa, and Santa Clara. By the end of the 1800s, California was producing 1.1 million hectoliters of wine a year, which is about 1.5 million bottles. America's love affair with these wines was not always so rosy, though. In 1919, the Volstead Act declared prohibition. This probably conjures images of speakeasies, gangsters, Al Capone, Elliot Ness. I mean, it does for me anyway. People became incredibly crafty, though, in this time to have their favorite beverage, their alcoholic beverage. By 1925, in New York City alone, there might have been maybe as many as 100,000 speakeasy clubs. One of them, the 21 Club, is still a highly rated restaurant today. Today, the restaurant takes up a few buildings, but during Prohibition time, they occupied only one, but they kept their cellar in the basement of the adjacent building. You could only get into the cellar through a secret hidden door, which had a special key. You inserted this long metal hook into one of the many holes in the cement door, which was a few feet thick, and the door to the cellar would magically open. A few times cops came and raided the 21 Club, but there was a mechanism at the bar that the bartender could just press so that all of the bottles and the glasses would just fall directly into the sewer just underneath the building. The intentions of this noble experiment of prohibition were good, because at the time they thought it would improve society and production, but it was a complete failure and one of the most disastrous in history of social policy. Wine consumption actually more than doubled during Prohibition, from about 60 million to 150 million gallons, mostly due to families making their own wine at home. On the other hand, it almost completely destroyed the budding American wine industry. To give you an idea of its impact, wine production in the U.S. plummeted over 93% from maybe 200 plus million cases in 1918 to 13 million in 1925. Prohibition ended in December 5th, 1933, and commercial winemakers struggled after this and after World War II. But after 1970, the California wine industry profited from a burst of investment. And when the 60 Minutes episode on the French paradox aired in 1991, the industry was infused with another surge of capital. I should tell you, though, that the individual state laws left over from Prohibition still impact us today. It's illegal for certain states, for example, to ship wine to others, like Texas wine to Virginia. Now, California accounts for 90% of U.S. wine production. That's 189 million cases a year, making this state the fourth largest producer of wine in the entire world. It has a great climate for growing grapes. Let's use Napa Valley as an example. It has about 57.7 degrees Fahrenheit average yearly temperature with over 2,000 hours of sunshine a year. California is a bit touchy about their wine quality, and you can see this in their labeling laws. Although federal law requires 75% of wine to come from the state to be on the label, California state law says 100% of the wine must come from California if it says California on the label. So let's delve a little deeper into specific regions. In Europe, we had a specific region called appellations that were singled out for having a unique character. If you see this geographic location on the label, it must come from this region and showcase the region's characteristics. In the United States, though, they don't call them appellations. They call them something different. They call them the American Viticultural Areas, or AVAs, and they're defined by geographic and climatic boundaries. However, unlike France's appellation contrôlée laws, there are no restrictions or limitations on yield, planting specific varieties or irrigation, so on and so forth. But California winemakers are much freer to experiment with their techniques. They're not bound by those same laws. So this freedom's allowed them to develop their own style, which has brought them to the international status that they have today. You should also know that unlike what we saw in the Old World, there's no legal definition of the word reserve on an American label and can mean vastly different things from either the longest aged in oak, a better selection of grapes, older vines, or it might mean nothing at all. I mean, it could just be marketing. Ever since the Judgment of Paris, Napa Valley has been synonymous with high quality. You generally don't see any entry-level pricing or jug wine from Napa Valley. Napa Valley is in Northern California, about a 2-hour drive north of San Francisco. But about 65 million years ago, the Pacific tectonic plate moved against the North American plate and formed two mountain ranges, the Mayacamas mountain range and the Vaca mountain range. Nestled among them is the Napa Valley. You don't see limestone chalk here as you do in France, but the earth is very fertile. Sometimes it's too fertile. Rich soil is not necessarily a requirement for grapes, and too many nutrients can force the vine to focus too much on the shoot and leaf growth, which we call vigor, than on the fruit. So many times Napa producers have to do something to restrict the vine's vigor, meaning the green parts of the vine, to direct the energy from the vines into the grapes for higher quality wine, rather than the green parts. If you've ever been to San Francisco, you realize how cool and wet it can be. Mark Twain was quoted for saying, "The coldest winter I ever spent was a summer in San Francisco." However, the Mayacamas and Vaca Range mountains form a protective barrier that subdues the maritime influence and prevents much of the stormy weather from entering the valley. So when you take that drive from San Francisco north to Napa Valley, you literally witness a climate change. It gets much sunnier and drier, you'll notice. In addition, unlike some climates in Europe, where it rains throughout the growing season, in Napa it mostly rains in the winter months, which means spring, summer, and fall are generally ideal. This is called a Mediterranean climate. Not only does this make it perfect for vacationing, but growers don't have to worry as much about fungal disease as they do in Europe. Also, because of the climate, vintages are very consistent year on year. Although occasionally a critic might rate a particular vintage poorly, in general you don't see a bad vintage in California. Not like you do in cooler climates in Europe, anyway. However, this beautiful, sunny, dry weather during the entire growing season has only one flaw. They need water at the right times during the growing season to make quality grapes, so irrigation is necessary. If you're a wine enthusiast, and perhaps you've been reading ratings and blogs, perhaps you've come across the view that irrigation is a bad thing, because they don't do that in Europe, or because it's not natural. This is a little short-sighted, as European vineyards, particularly in the north, don't need water, don't need irrigation because of their climate. However, methinks they protest too much. Years ago, I was in southern France, and while I was walking through the vineyard, I spotted irrigation tubes. And I asked one of the workers, what are they for? And he says, they're for the roses. I'm like, all along the row of the entire vineyard? No, it wasn't for the roses. Here we have a Napa Chardonnay and Cabernet Sauvignon, which is what they're best known for in Napa Valley. Here we have the Chardonnay. Notice it is a yellow gold color. It's not too deep, it's not having orange flecks in it, but if you compare it, let's say, to a Sauvignon Blanc, you're definitely going to see it's a much deeper color. And if you compared this wine to its classic in Burgundy, a white Burgundy, you would definitely notice that this wine is deeper in color. Let's do the chest, chin, nose test. This is not as aromatic, but again, that's Chardonnay. But what we do get is a lot of apple-y fruit, like Chardonnay, but it's more ripe. It's almost like baked apples, or almost like apple pie. And also you get a hint of butter, which we've talked about before. We talked of malolactic fermentation in a previous lecture, and that gives us that, the diacetyl that's created there gives us that buttery kind of aroma, and also reduces the acid a little bit. So let's taste it. This is another end of the spectrum for Chardonnay. The Chardonnays that come from Napa Valley are very full-bodied, This has a well-balanced acidity, but it's a bit lower, definitely lower than what you would see in the classic climates for Burgundy. You'll also notice on the back palate, you feel a definite warmth there. This is an indication to us that it comes from a warm climate. But also notice the length of the wine. This lasts a really long time. This is a high-quality Chardonnay. Now, we've talked about people saying, it's $5 or it's even $14 and it must, be the same quality level. Well, here we have the William Hill, which is probably about the $14 price level. And if you taste that in comparison to the Sequoia Grove, which is much higher in price, you're going to notice that the length lasts a lot longer. So even though some of the flavors are similar, the length is going to be much longer, and that's an indicator of quality. Chardonnay has grown all over California and is America's best-selling wine. But in Napa, they take on a more luscious, rich, full-bodied quality. The style of Chardonnay is totally at the opposite end of the spectrum from Chablis, which, remember from Lecture 11, is quite delicate and light and crisp. You see Chardonnay at all price points across California, but you generally see more expensive ones coming from Napa, which is what we just spoke about. And the least expensive ones in California just have the designation California on the label. We tasted Robert Mondavi's Fumé Blanc in Lecture 4. The term Fumé Blanc was coined by Robert Mondavi himself in Napa Valley. Mondavi was also a pioneer in winemaking for the United States, and California in particular. In fact, Robert Mondavi was instrumental in establishing varietal labeling, meaning they placed the name of the grape variety on the label. Unlike European labels, U.S. labels name the grape variety. If we know we like this particular grape, this system can really make it easier for us to find a wine that we like. Now, in the 1970s, Robert Mondavi was inspired by Pouilly-Fumé in the Loire Valley, as this is where Sauvignon Blanc originated. However, Fumé in French means smoke, and the oak-style Sauvignon Blanc that he created gave it a smoky flavor, very different than the unoaked Loire benchmark. It has the great acidity, lemon notes, and grassy flavor typical of Sauvignon Blanc, but with a beautiful hint of vanilla character and toast and a touch of spice. Generally, the style of Sauvignon Blanc in California was Fumé Blanc. However, it doesn't always say on the label Fumé Blanc, even if it sees a little bit of oak. Here we have the Cakebread Cellars Sauvignon Blanc, which is one of the most popular Sauvignon Blancs in the United States. And even though it sees a little bit of oak in its winemaking, not a ton, and I don't think it's new, but it has a little bit of oak on it, but it doesn't say on the bottle Fumé Blanc. It's a good idea to look at the back label sometimes, as they'll tell you if it sees some oak. It may not say directly. You may see something that says hint of vanilla. This is an indication to you that it may have been exposed to oak. I mean, if you like that character, this can definitely help you choose a bottle of wine that you like. Like Chardonnay, Cabernet Sauvignon can be found at every price point. Napa is well known for its high-quality Cabernet and is home to cult status Cabernets like Screaming Eagle that goes for over $1,500 a bottle. Now here we have Frog's Leap, a high-quality cab. Let's look at the color. Again, it's a deep ruby purple. Can't see your fingers through it, so it's opaque. Let's smell it. We get that black currant. We get really upfront fruit. Again, that tells us that this comes from the New World. Not getting a whole lot of minerality there. But let's taste it. Very, very fruity. And sometimes what they call California Cabernet Sauvignon, there's a word they call, and that it's jammy. You'll see the word jamminess a lot in wine critics, especially when it comes to California wines. But this definitely sees it. And you see a little bit of vanilla character on there as well, so you know that this has been matured in oak. Now on the palate, it's definitely dry, but it has this sweet impression of fruit. It doesn't have any sugar in it, but it feels and seems sweet. But it's got a good tannic grip, and sometimes the oak, the oxygen that gets through the oak can really round some of the edges of those tannins. But as we discussed earlier, California is allowed to do a lot of experimentation, and they do this process called micro-oxygenation, where they allow some of the oxygen to go into the tanks even before they put it in barrel to get further softness to those tannins. So there's a lot of technical expertise that's going on in California. Now, As we mentioned in Lecture 6, Merlot fills some of the palate gaps that Cabernet Sauvignon sometimes lacks on the palate. This is why you see them blended on both the left bank and the right bank of Bordeaux in their native environment. So let's taste the Merlot. Here we have Frey Brothers, which is actually a Gallo brand. And it's deep in color. Definitely notice that it's deep in color. This is a thick-skinned variety. Again, that's a clue. It's moderately aromatic. It's not intensely aromatic, but this is typical for Merlot. Let's smell it. Very dark fruit. A lot of blackberry, a lot of black plum, but again, we're getting a jamminess in there. It's really rich, ripe, upfront fruit, which is the typical sign for the New World. Now let's taste it. After tasting the Cabernet Sauvignon, you're going to notice that the Merlot is lower in acidity and feels softer, feels like falling into a pillow because it's soft on the palate, not as much tannins. It's a little bit softer in its acidity, and it's got this stronger mid-palate. It feels fleshier, and they call that more mouth-filling fruit. And this is why they say that Merlot, it has a lush mid-palate, and it fills the gaps for Cabernet Sauvignon, which seems to kind of have a lower mid-palate. But the fruit in the California Merlot is quite succulent, and the tannins are very, very silky smooth. I mean, it's got some tannin in there, but it's nowhere near the grip of Cabernet Sauvignon. Now, in Lecture 10, I mentioned the French garagistes, or garage winemakers, who focus on high quality in tiny quantities for Bordeaux blends. Well, California has really led the way in creating new blends and wines, sometimes literally out of a garage, with a very personalized, hands-on approach. I asked Brian Page of Page Wine Cellars Revolver Wine to tell us what garage winemaking means to him.
Garage winemaking is stripped down winemaking. None of the fluff, none of that any things that is faux. It's just real winemaking done by hand. I think the garage winemaking that my brother and I do is more in the lines of what you're getting is what my brother and I actually work on. These aren't having 3 or 4 of the people in the winery. It is actually my brother and myself directly working with the wine, directly working with the grapes to get a product that we can say our sweat and blood literally is in the product. Really a signature of what my brother and I are trying to do when it comes to the product that we put out, the wines that we put out. It is really truly a direct connection, a direct reflection of what we're trying to do as a family and as 2 brothers making wine.
To the west of Napa Valley is Sonoma Valley, which you may also have heard of. Do you know where the word Sonoma comes from? Actually, it's derived from a local Winton Native American word for nose. So I think it's appropriately named for a wine region, don't you? Instead of one, there are 6 fertile valleys that combine to make up Sonoma, and its reputation for quality is renowned, though they're not as well known as Napa Valley. In general, Sonoma's climate is cooler than Napa's, especially in the north of the valley, because it's closer to the ocean and isn't protected by those mountain ranges. It's also much hillier here too. The topography kind of reminds me of Piedemonte, where, driving through here, I got sick in the car going around all of these little twists and turns. But this means there's all kinds of pockets of unique microclimates for terroir. Sonoma producers are the pioneers of cool climate grape varieties in California. Where Napa may be the Bordeaux of the U.S. because it does well with Cab and Merlot, Sonoma is the Burgundy because of its focus on Pinot Noir. They have Chardonnay as well, and because of the cooler climate, Sonoma Chardonnays tend to be a little higher in acidity and lower in alcohol than those of Napa. Here we have a Pinot Noir, and it's from the AVA of Russian River Valley. Look at the color. It's a Pinot Noir, so this is definitely paler. So this is a thin-skinned variety. Definitely smell a lot more aromatics here, but again, that's typical for Pinot Noir. It is an aromatic grape variety. And you get those beautiful bursts of strawberry fruit and raspberry fruit and cherry. And for Russian River, always, my benchmark for Russian River has been, don't laugh, it's cherry cola. But that's my marker for Russian River whenever I taste it. Bourgogne Rouge smells more mineral-like. That's Old World, but this is New World Pinot. So you get a lot more upfront fruit there. And some people say that California Pinot Noir smells almost like strawberry jam. Now let's look on the palate. The palate's much lighter in body. Much lighter in body than the wines that we've experienced before. But again, if we were comparing this to the Bourgogne Rouge, it's a fuller in body than that, and lower in acidity, and a little bit higher in alcohol as well. The Sonoma Valley and its AVAs such as Russian River is one of the best known AVAs for Pinot Noir. But there are also well-known regions of Carneros and Santa Barbara that are known for Pinot Noir. In terms of style, Carneros tends to be the most delicate because its climate is much cooler. You also see high-quality Pinot Noir in Santa Barbara, which is farther south but still north of Los Angeles. In Santa Barbara, we find a climate cooled by mountain breezes pulled from the Pacific, which makes it the perfect area to grow high-quality Burgundian grapes like Chardonnay and Pinot Noir. However, in Santa Barbara, as well as in north central and south central coast, you also see some Syrah. This is the home of the Rhone Rangers. What do I mean by that? Producers from these areas, particularly Bonnie Doon in Santa Cruz in the north and Coupé in Santa Maria Valley in the south, as well as in Napa Valley, you see Joseph Phelps. These producers really pioneered in creating a Rhone-style wine with a New World influence. Though these wines definitely taste New World with their upfront fruit and their rich raspberry tones, they focus a little bit more on the herbal notes and the hints of black pepper spice, which is the vein of the Rhone Valley versus the style of Shiraz, which we'll talk about in Lecture 22. Moving inland, we come to the Central Valley, which is hot, flat, and dry, except for Lodi, which is a little bit cooler, and they produce some good quality, cool climate wines. 3/4 of all California wine comes from this hotter, drier region, and one company, Gallo, produces much of that. If you're a satisfied sipper from Lecture 1, then you may know this name very, very well. The Gallo brothers, Ernest and Julio, were real pioneers in the industry, and Gallo is the largest family-owned winery in the world, with some of the best-selling brands in supermarkets and grocery stores. I've toured their warehouses, and to my surprise, I saw stacks of premium brands I never knew were owned by Gallo. They have state-of-the-art quality control, and their salespeople have the reputation of being the best trained in the industry. There's one grape that we have not talked too much about, and that's primarily grown in California, which is Zinfandel. It's a Vitis vinifera and a cousin of the grape Primitivo in Italy, which has a similar DNA, and we mentioned this in Lecture 14. Now, let's take a look at the color of Zinfandel. Here we have the St. Francis Zinfandel, and this is their single vineyard, Pagani Ranch. It's a very deep color. A very deep, deep ruby. Can't see your fingers through it. And Zinfandel is a thick-skinned grape variety. And the grapes come from vines that are over 100 years old in this specific vineyard of the Pagani Ranch. And sometimes the vines themselves have trunks that are thicker than my thighs. It's moderately aromatic. It's not incredibly aromatic, but it's not mute either. But we get dark fruit here, black cherry, some cranberry kind of aromas. But I also get some cinnamon and a little hint of dried fruit, something like raisins, something similar to what we saw with Amarone. The reason is that it's an uneven ripener. How this works is you have a cluster of grapes, and on the grape cluster, you have some that are really, really ripe, and you have some that are not so ripe. But the winemaker has to wait until everything's ripe in order to pick it. So by the time it does, the ones that were ripe originally are now a little bit raisinated, and that's where you get some of that raisinated kind of dried fruit character in Zinfandel. Well, let's taste it. You'll notice it's really quite nice in its acidity, because even though it's got an intense amount of fruit and very full-bodied, that acidity balances it really, really nicely. But also notice you got a lot of warmth there. It's pretty high alcohol, And Zinfandels are known for its high level of alcohol because they can get really high to like the level of port. But some of the flavors that we're seeing here is very similar to what we saw in Amarone in Lecture 13. But this has a seamless balance. And you'll notice on the palate it's got a very chocolatey kind of texture. And I think this one definitely has some American oak in it because I get a little bit of the coconut character in there. Now, one of the wines I started with when I was studying was the St. Francis Old Vines Zinfandel. I loved the intensity of fruit, spice, and American oak in this wine. And it's a real powerful wine for such a great price. Here we have what I just tasted was the Pagani Vineyard from Sonoma. Like I said, these vines are over 100 years old. And when you have vines that are that old, it concentrates all of the berries. It concentrates all of the fruit and everything into those berries. That's why it's very, very rich and luscious. You see Zinfandel all over California, and it's another beach bunny. It loves the sun. You also see great Zinfandels in Paso Robles AVA in the Central Coast. Another incredible variety you see in California is Petite Syrah, which actually has no relation whatsoever to Syrah. It has very, very tiny berries, which is probably where the name Petite came from, and it creates wines that are very deep in color, dark in fruit, and like blackberries and plum and black cherry, but a rich density and high level of tannin. Here we have the one from Bogle, which is, I think, an incredible value because when I buy it in New York, it's for about $12. It has so much flavor and so much punch for such a reasonable price. By this point in the course, you may be thinking of going to California wine country. It can be a great trip with your sweetheart and with your friends. Well, when you do go, if you haven't already, you'll be visiting winery tasting rooms. And there is etiquette you should be aware of. So let's close today's lecture by going back to Stag's Leap for a lesson on what to do during a wine tasting. When you arrive at a tasting room, what they're going to do is provide you with a list. And sometimes they are tiered or leveled in different categories. They will give you different glasses. Now, Ben, why don't you please tell us what do we have here in this selection?
Well, what we have here is a Chardonnay, a single vineyard Chardonnay from one of our estate vineyards, and then 3 Cabernets, 2 from our estate vineyards, and then 1 that is a blend from our 2 estate vineyards as well.
Thank you. Also what they give you is a piece of paper that you can write notes on. What you also have as well is probably a paper towel just in case you spill any of the wine, and you have a spittoon, which is actually quite important. So you're going to pick up your glass, you're going to do the 5 S's of tasting wine, which we've already covered. So you're going to see, you're going to swirl, you're going to sniff, and you're going to sip. And then you spit. Actually, that's part of tasting room etiquette. It's not rude at all to spit in the tasting room. And actually, you probably should if you don't have a designated driver. And then the 5th S, you sit there and you savor it. And you see how long that finish is. And by the time you get to the last wine, go back to the first wine because you're going to find that it does change dramatically after a few minutes in the glass. So it's always good to go back and forth between the wines, not only to taste the difference the first time around, but to see how it's changed in the glass. While at Stag's Leap, Ben told me a tasting tip he shares with customers. When you're first developing your nose and palate, try not to read the Cliff's Notes on the tasting sheet before you taste. Read them after you form your own opinion, and then compare your notes to theirs. This will help you develop your own scent vocabulary. So you'll know perhaps that when you think vanilla, other people are thinking apple or something along those lines. It's good advice. Next up, we'll be moving on to the wines of the Pacific Northwest, focusing on Washington and Oregon. And you'll need the following wines: an Oregon Pinot Gris, an Italian Pinot Grigio, an Oregon Pinot Noir, preferably from Willamette, a Washington Merlot, a California Merlot, and a Washington Syrah, if you can find it. The wines from Oregon and Washington are much cooler in climate in comparison to California, and they make some wines that definitely rival California, even though they've rivaled the benchmark of France. So let's see what that's all about. And until next time, cheers.